Before we open for Q&A, I can resist to draw some contrasts with the Brazilian case because, as in Australia, we faced a huge crisis in the 80s. It was already clear in those days that the import substitution industrialization process has come to an end, and that we were sort of bogged down in our incapacity to overcome the old model of industrialization. And the most notorious symptom of that crisis was hyperinflation. But the big difference is that we reacted to that challenge in a much slower, unevenly, and disorderly way than Australia did. And I think this has to do with a couple of features of Brazilian society and Brazilian political system. First, hugely fragmented federation, and that became even more fragmented after the Constitution of 1988, right, with the creation of 5,800 municipalities with a lot of autonomous powers in terms of taxation, regulation, and so on and so forth. Second, not a bipartisan system, not a Westminster kind of system, but a system which is characterized by a huge and growing fragmentation of the political party system. And not last but not the least, I think that we are a much more unequal society, and that the import substitution model accentuated inequalities in terms of reinforcing the power of special interest groups in terms of rent seeking. So the Machiavellian challenge to Brazil was much greater than in the case of, I think we are still taking into consideration all of that. We've done a reasonably good job, but I would like to quote Churchill also, but we can have a less benign view on Brazil in this respect. So this protected and slower reform process, very disorderly, uneven, can be compared to political suicide, right? And as Churchill said, the bad thing about political suicide is that you live to see the consequences. So having said that, I open the.
The only thing I'd say to that is you live to see the unintended consequences.
Yes, some of them are intended. Please identify yourself. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions, very concise ones, because they have to leave.
Okay. My name is Norberto Valdrighi. Professor Banks, thank you. First question, the question is, you showed what Australia did roughly in the 80s, started in the 80s. What would you change were we in this 21st century world? And you mentioned something about tax reform, and you didn't mention anything about pension reform. Anything done in Australia in this process? Thank you.
Here. Aqui.
Bom dia, meu nome é Rosana Nespoli.
You will need this.
Ah.
How that works. Here. Is it on?
Gary, meu inglês não é tão bom, portanto, vou lhe perguntar em português. Seja bem-vindo ao Brasil. Espero que você tenha trazido aí uma máscara de oxigênio, porque, enfim. Hoje, nós observamos no Brasil uma tentativa de desmantelamento de políticas já estruturadas e avaliadas, algumas delas como positivas, construídas ao longo de décadas para o funcionamento do nosso país. E esse, entre aspas, aí, desmantelamento está dirigido especialmente na retirada de pontos de controle necessários para o acompanhamento de políticas, né? Salvo melhor juízo, os pontos de controle são necessários. A pergunta é, você acredita que a política pública pode prescindir, abrir mão de uma ação fiscalizatória? O governo ele pode abrir mão da checagem de conformidade em relação às regras que compõem uma política pública? Obrigada.
Ok, aqui, mais uma.
My name is Denis Guimarães, and I'm a practitioner and researcher in Brazil about antitrust and regulation in general. Professor, you mentioned the systematic review of anti-competitive regulation. I'd like to know if the ACCC has a role in this process.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Final one here.
Hi, I'm Gabriela. I wanted to ask about inequality. You showed that the reforms brought a lot of growth, and it was also very distributed among society. But Brazil is a really unequal country, and when we talk about dysregulating labor markets, we always say, oh, but will be the poorest people that will pay for that. And I wanted to talk about how inequality evolved in Australia during the reform time and how the reforms impacted that, or if you have any numbers.
So piggybacking on her question, how is the union movement and trade unions, how they have reacted to labor reform and reorganized themselves, especially at the local level?
Yeah. I might address this one first, if you like. I'll go back through it. I think the first one's very hard, and the second one's quite hard as well. So let me start with this one, which is also hard. Huh? There are no easy questions here. So I think one of the secrets of the Australian reform experience, particularly in relation to the labour market, I think, was that the earlier waves of reform in relation to trade liberalisation were shown actually to be relatively benign in terms of the labour market and what people had been concerned about. They were benign for two reasons, I think. One was the tariff reductions, although they were very substantial over time, were announced in advance and were graduated. They were phased in. So there was a tops-down reduction from some quite high rates. So if you had a tariff, for example, of 15%, your reductions didn't occur until the second wave of tariff reductions. So initially high tariffs were brought down to 15% over 5 years, and then tariffs of 15% were brought down to 5% over the next 4 years. So there was anticipation of it, which allowed some adjustment and sort of gradual impacts in terms of impacts on the market. But the second thing is that Australia has quite a comprehensive unemployment program, welfare program, so that if you do lose your job, you at least had the safety net of, people would argue how generous it is, but you had the safety net of a minimal amount of money from the government to allow you to do okay and to look around. But in addition to that, the government provided some assistance for job search, and in some cases for retraining, particularly where it was an industry that was concentrated in a particular region, etc. Then there was some programs to redevelop the region or redevelop the skills of the people in the region or help them move out of the region to somewhere else where the jobs were located. So these things all mattered. Others would argue that in addition to that, the fact that the government initiating these reforms was a Labor government headed by a Prime Minister who'd previously been the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions made a difference. And I think when you think about it, that there's some logic to that. And we had at that time not only some exceptional political leaders, but we had some far-sighted leaders of our trade union movement who, particularly for the peak body, could look at what was good for the labour movement for Australia as a whole, not just the labour movement for the textile sector or the automotive sector or the white goods sector. So I think that was another ingredient in that. But as I say, ultimately, success breeds success. And it was the fact that although there were people who lost their jobs, the bigger picture of impacts on the labour market was relatively benign. In fact, what we saw was unprecedented job creation in Australia after a little while. As the dynamism of the economy increased, as opportunities that weren't there before for new businesses to start up because their costs were lower, there was more flexibility, then more people were being hired. And so we saw, I have another chart which I showed in another presentation, but you can see that actually unemployment fell as the tariff fell, which was the opposite to what a lot of people were worried about. Someone asked about the ACCC. So the ACCC is the competition regulator and looks at antitrust regulation in particular and mergers regulation, etc., and also, in Australia's case, consumer law. The competition that I'm talking about is competition is barriers to competition caused by government regulation. Right, so it required not so much the ACCC, which is looking at monopolies and anti-competitive behaviour by firms, but looking at what government is doing to impede competition. So it's a slightly different job to the job of the competition regulator. And the way it was done, typically, depending on the significance of the regulation, there would be a task force or a small group or conducted a mini inquiry. In some cases, the Productivity Commission looked at it if it was a big issue, and so on. And the monitoring was done by this other council. So the short answer to your question is the ACCC wasn't directly involved in that legislative review program, but it plays a very important part in Australia generally in looking at competition. And in fact, if you're interested in the power of Google and what Google means to our economies in terms of the concentration of market power, etc., the ACCC has just produced a report on that, which I think is one of the first reports internationally to think about how you deal with that very tricky issue. There was a question about removing regulatory controls, and I'm not sure I fully understood it, but it seemed to be saying what role is there for enforcement and monitoring in all of this. And I think I may not be answering your question, but in Australia, when there was regulatory reform, typically the main question was, what is the regulation trying to do? And what is needed in terms of enforcement and monitoring to ensure that it does its job properly? Traditionally in Australia, the regulators were focused on compliance above all else. Costs of compliance were generally not really considered. So regulators in Australia now, in their approaches, are required to think much more and even provide performance indicators on their impacts on efficiency, not just compliance with the regulatory standard and so on. So I'd see enforcement as very much dependent on the nature of the regulation and to what extent this is required. We have had a period, of course, and you might have had in Brazil, where we've had industry itself self-regulating and enforcing its own regulations. In some cases that's worked very well, in other cases it hasn't. So there's clearly a role for enforcement, I think, but the history of enforcement, and there's OECD studies on this that you could look at, the history of enforcement is often it has been too heavy-handed, it's involved high compliance costs in itself, and so designing enforcement to ensure that it doesn't impose additional costs has been quite important. But I'm not sure that I've answered your question. I'm happy to come back. If Australia was reforming in the 21st century, would it do anything differently? My worry is it wouldn't do anything at all. I hope there's no media present. I think
it's all on the record.
I think Machiavelli is on steroids in the 21st century. I think the new media, I think social expectations, etc., the power of pressure groups and so on, all of this, it makes life much more difficult for our governments, I think. However, I still think, when I think about the combination of circumstances that the OECD described that were the ingredients of successful reform in the past, I think they're perennial I think they would still work today, but more effort might have to go into certain elements. I think getting public, in broad terms, getting a consensus or even just sufficient agreement or lack of opposition to proceed is a bit more challenging today. And I'd have to say, on the basis of 3 days in Brazil, I suspect it's more challenging in Brazil than it was in Australia, you know, for a whole range of reasons that you're very familiar with. But that's not to say the principle's wrong. I think it just requires more effort. And in particular, that effort's justified and warranted because, if possible, you'd want to emulate the Australian experience whereby reforms were maintained and sustained even with the change of government in the future. So demonstrating that these are good reforms, getting at least broad acceptance of that, and hopefully they turn out well, are all reasons, are all preconditions, I think, for an incoming government in the future leaving those reforms in place. And there are a number of countries in the world, including here in Latin America, where some reforms have been seen as quite radical, they've been introduced, but then you see an incoming government actually keep those reforms or only change them slightly. And that's generally been when they've been well chosen. So, and also to be completely honest with you, I think our record in the 21st century has not been as good at reform as it was in the latter 20th century. And it reflects these issues that I think our government, as with other governments, is struggling more with the new politics than in the past. But we've had some success stories, and typically where we've had success, it's passed those criteria. It's ticked those boxes of the OECD and our own background. Pension reforms, my head spins whenever those words come up because it's a complex area of policy, and in Australia we've had a range of pension reforms. I guess one of the things the OECD would rate Australia highly on is that we have a federal pension which is available to people based on their income. So it's means tested, it's very targeted, and therefore it's been it hasn't been a problem in terms of fiscal sustainability. In the public sector, we've progressively changed the superannuation arrangements for public servants, to put it briefly, to make them less generous, right? And this was very important because we did a study which showed, as I think has been the case here in Brazil, that if you extrapolated into the future, it was totally unsustainable to maintain these high rates of pension, early rates of retirement and so on. So the retirement age has been getting older in Australia. There's been talk of making 70 the minimum retirement age, etc. But also the pensions have become more contributory and less based on your final salary and more in terms of what you've contributed. And then we've got the superannuation, compulsory superannuation requirement for businesses to give 9% of the salaries of their employees into their pension funds, etc. This has been vigorously debated at the moment in Australia as to whether that should be increased or not. And there's been an issue about how successful that scheme has been. But I don't pretend to be an expert in this area. But if you're interested in Australia's pension experience, there are quite a few studies that have been done that I'm sure the embassy would be able to point you to.
I know you have to leave. If you allow me, one last comment on the comment you made about the difficulties of promoting reforms in the 21st century. And I just want to highlight the fact that there is a all-out attack against reason, evidence-based policy, and experts, right? I think it's enough to mention that a member of the cabinet of Boris Johnson, who was a leading figure of Brexit, Michael Gove, said a few months ago, or just after Brexit, and this is a guy who I think was graduated in Oxford or Cambridge, was studied in Eton, so typical member of a very highly educated member of the British elite who said, "We are fed up with experts." Right? And this is, I think this is one of the basic characteristics, features of populism nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, and I've had to think about this a little bit, because does it represent a challenge, for example, to the model that Australia has followed? And is this a difference for the 21st century, that the work of the Commission, for example, today would not be trusted or influential in debate? The facts are that the Commission's work is still taken very seriously. It's looked at by all sides of politics and is used. And I think the difference is it's not just seen as academic work or technocratic work. It's seen as work that's involved an inclusive process in which the public has been participating. So the public owns
How
to some extent.
How does the public participate?
So the public participates. When I say public, generally it's not individual households,
All
but
right.
it's representative bodies, stakeholders,
Right.
etc. But it can be individuals, and the Commission, the formal way is through public hearings, in which any member of the public in Australia could come and tell the Commission their story and argue for different changes or say why certain changes should not happen, and so on. For example, my first inquiry when I became chairman of the Commission was into the regulation of the gambling industries. Right? So I was appointed to chair this inquiry, and someone from the social welfare sector was appointed as my associate commissioner. So he started believing that gambling was evil, and I started believing, well, people should do what they like, right?
It
And
can
we
be
ended up in the middle.
Can be a source of revenue.
Well, that's right. So, but in that inquiry, we had individuals come along and tell us their stories about how problem gambling had, had caused,
it's serious.
etc. So it's potentially very open. In practice, the average inquiry would have a lot of interest from the stakeholder groups and the representatives and so on. But unlike a situation in which policy is made without a transparent process, everybody gets to see what everybody else says and to comment on that, right? So if you're advocating a particular policy, someone contradicts it, you can have a say as well. And the Commission often organises roundtables in which the stakeholders from different sides, for example, on the gambling industry, I organised a one-day roundtable with the the chief executives of the gambling organisations of Australia, the big corporations, Tabcorp and others, casinos, etc., the gaming machines and all of that, on the one side of the table. On the other side of the table, I had the social activists who were arguing, the community welfare people who were arguing that this was a bad thing. And we organised a debate. And what was very interesting was that the tenor of that debate was very civilised compared to what happens when these people talk to the media or talk out there. And it led to me getting a sense of where the areas of agreement potentially could be. But at the end of the day, I have to confess that this was one of the areas in which the Productivity Commission was less successful because of the tax revenue that goes to state governments.
Right. Right.
The average state government in Australia gets 10% of its total revenue from gambling. So so normally the Treasury is an advocate for reform. In this case, that wasn't so. So I shouldn't leave you with the impression that Australia has been universally successful in everything we've done. But we're trying to learn from our successes and our failures, and if any of that is relevant to Brazil,
all of this is relevant. All of this.
So thank you.
Gary Banks, thank you so much.
Thank you.